Husband took his mistress to the company ball, and then froze when his ex-wife kissed the billionaire. The grand ballroom of the Grand Royal Hotel sparkled under crystal chandeliers, each light reflecting off champagne glasses and designer gowns. Tonight was the annual gala of Vance Corporation, one of New York's most prestigious investment firms, and the city's elite had gathered to celebrate another year of extraordinary profits. Barbara Harris smoothed her emerald silk dress one final time before stepping through the hotel's revolving doors. At 31, she possessed the kind of understated elegance that couldn't be bought. High cheekbones, auburn hair swept into a sophisticated chignon, and eyes that held both wisdom and carefully concealed pain. 3 months had passed since her divorce from Chris Vance was finalized. 3 months since her world had shattered into 1,000 pieces. The doorman nodded respectfully. "Good evening, Mrs. Harris." She had reclaimed her maiden name immediately after the papers were signed. It was a small victory, but tonight, she would need every ounce of strength she could muster. As Barbara entered the ballroom, conversations momentarily paused. Heads turned, whispers began, and she felt the familiar weight of being watched. She had expected this. After all, she was the discarded wife making her first public appearance since the scandal broke. "Barbara," she turned to see Margaret Sinclair, wife of the firm's chief operating officer, approaching with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity in her eyes. "Margaret, how lovely to see you." Barbara's voice was steady, warm even. "You look absolutely radiant, dear. How are you holding up?" Before Barbara could answer, a commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. The murmurs grew louder, more pointed. Barbara didn't need to turn around to know what was happening. She could feel it in the sudden tension that filled the air. Chris Vance had arrived, and he wasn't alone. 36 years old and devastatingly handsome in his custom-tailored tuxedo, Chris still commanded attention the moment he entered any room. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his jaw clean-shaven, and his smile, the same smile that had once made Barbara's heart race, now felt like a knife twist in her chest. But it was the woman on his arm that made the room collectively hold its breath. Stacy Hyduck was everything Barbara wasn't. 26, platinum blonde, and utterly shameless in her skin-tight gold sequined dress that left little to the imagination. She clung to Chris's arm like a trophy, her laugh ringing out across the ballroom as photographers snapped pictures. "The nerve of him," Margaret whispered, "bringing her here, to your event." Barbara watched as Chris's eyes scanned the room until they found hers. For a moment, time seemed suspended. She saw something flicker across his face. Regret? Uncertainty? But it was gone in an instant, replaced by that arrogant confidence she had once found so attractive. Stacy must have noticed the exchange because she suddenly pulled Chris closer, standing on her tiptoes to whisper something in his ear that made him laugh. Then she looked directly at Barbara, her smile sharp as a blade. "Excuse me?" Barbara murmured to Margaret, and walked purposefully toward the bar. She ordered a glass of champagne, her hands steady despite the hurricane of emotions swirling inside her. This was Chris's world, his company, his colleagues. She had built relationships here too, but tonight she felt like an intruder in her own life. Well, if it isn't the Ice Queen herself. Barbara turned to find Stacy standing beside her. Chris nowhere in sight. "Stacy," Barbara's voice was perfectly neutral. "You know I have to thank you," Stacy continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "for being such a terrible wife. Really, you made my job so easy." Barbara sipped her champagne, studying the younger woman with cool detachment. "I'm glad I could help." "Oh, you have no idea how much you've helped. Chris tells me everything about your, shortcomings. How cold you were, how you never understood his needs." Stacy's smile widened. "But don't worry, honey. Some women are just meant to be practice rounds." The words hit their mark just as Stacy intended. But Barbara had learned something important over the past 3 months. Pain could either destroy you or forge you into something stronger. "You're absolutely right," Barbara said quietly, setting down her glass. "Some women are practice rounds, and some," she met Stacy's eyes directly, "are just passing phases." Before Stacy could respond, the lights dimmed and the evening's host took the microphone. But as Barbara walked away, she caught sight of Chris watching from across the room, his expression unreadable. The real game was just beginning. The master of ceremonies stepped to the microphone, his voice booming across the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Vance Corporation's annual charity gala. Tonight we celebrate not only our financial success but our commitment to giving back to the community. Barbara found herself standing near the silent auction tables, studying the displayed items without really seeing them. Her mind was still reeling from her encounter with Stacy, but she refused to let it show. She had learned the hard way that in this world, showing weakness was like bleeding in shark-infested waters. "That's a beautiful piece," a warm voice said beside her. Barbara turned to see Eleanor Whitman, one of the city's most respected philanthropists and, more importantly, someone who had always treated her with genuine kindness. "Eleanor, how wonderful to see you." Barbara's smile was the first real one she'd managed all evening. "And you, dear, you look absolutely stunning tonight." Eleanor's eyes held a motherly concern. "How are you really doing?" "I'm adjusting," Barbara said carefully. "Some days are better than others." Eleanor nodded knowingly. "I've been through a divorce myself many years ago. The hardest part isn't the legal proceedings, it's facing people afterward. Everyone wants to know the details, pick sides, offer unsolicited advice." "Exactly." Barbara felt a wave of relief at being understood. "But you know what I learned?" Eleanor leaned closer. "Sometimes the end of one chapter is just the beginning of something far better. You're still young, brilliant, and you have your whole life ahead of you." Before Barbara could respond, a commotion near the main stage drew their attention. Chris had taken the microphone, Stacy glittering beside him like an expensive accessory. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Chris began, his voice carrying that commanding tone that had once made Barbara's heart skip. "This company has always been built on family values, commitment, and trust." Barbara nearly choked on the irony. Family values, commitment, trust. The very things he had destroyed when he brought Stacy into their marriage bed. "And speaking of family," Chris continued, his arm sliding around Stacy's waist, "I'd like to introduce someone very special to me, Stacy Haiduk, a remarkable woman who has brought new light into my life." The applause was polite but scattered. Barbara noticed several board members exchanging uncomfortable glances. Richard Lawson, the chairman of the board, looked particularly displeased. Stacy stepped forward, her voice honey-sweet as she addressed the crowd. "Thank you so much for welcoming me into this incredible Vance Corporation family. Chris has told me so much about all of you, and I just can't wait to be more involved in the company's future." Barbara's blood chilled. More involved? Stacy was already positioning herself not just as Chris's girlfriend, but as a future player in the business. "Of course," Stacy continued with a practiced smile, "I know change can be difficult for some people, but sometimes you have to let go of the past to embrace a brighter future." The words were clearly directed at Barbara, and several guests turned to look at her. Barbara felt the familiar burn of humiliation rising in her chest, but she kept her expression serene. Eleanor squeezed her arm gently. "Breathe, dear. Don't give her the satisfaction." As Chris and Stacy stepped down from the stage, the orchestra began playing and couples moved toward the dance floor. Barbara watched as Chris led Stacy into a waltz, the younger woman's dress sparkling under the lights like captured starlight. "They make quite the pair, don't they?" Barbara turned to find Janet Morrison, wife of one of Chris's biggest investors, standing beside her. Janet's tone was neutral, but her eyes held a calculating gleam. "They certainly seem suited to each other," Barbara replied diplomatically. Janet sipped her wine thoughtfully. "Although I have to say, some of us are a bit concerned about the optics. The divorce was so recent and now this very public display." She trailed off meaningfully. Barbara understood immediately. The business world was conservative, and Chris's behavior was making some investors uncomfortable. A CEO who couldn't maintain his personal commitments might not be trusted with their money. "I'm sure Chris knows what he's doing," Barbara said carefully, though inwardly she felt a spark of hope. If Chris's relationship with Stacy was affecting business confidence, "Of course," Janet agreed. "Though between you and me, some of the wives are finding Miss Haiduk's enthusiasm a bit much." She cornered poor Margaret Sinclair for 20 minutes earlier, talking about redecorating the corporate offices and hosting investor dinners. As if she's already planning to be the company's first lady. Barbara's stomach twisted. Stacy wasn't just sleeping with her ex-husband. She was trying to take over the life Barbara had built. "Ladies, how are we enjoying the evening?" They turned to find Chris approaching, his smile charming but his eyes cautious as they met Barbara's. "Chris," Barbara said evenly. "Lovely party. The decorations are exquisite." "Thank you. I remember how much you always enjoyed these events." For a moment something vulnerable flickered in his expression. "Yes, well, that was a long time ago." Barbara's voice was cool but not hostile. Janet cleared her throat. I should find my husband. Excuse me. She melted away, leaving Chris and Barbara alone. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Around them, the party continued. Laughter, clinking glasses, the soft strains of the orchestra. But in their small bubble, time seemed suspended. Barbara, Chris began. There you are, darling. Stacy appeared at Chris's side, sliding her arm possessively through his. I was looking everywhere for you. Her eyes fixed on Barbara with undisguised triumph. Oh, hello again. I hope you're having a wonderful time at our party. Our party. Barbara noted the possessive pronoun but kept her expression neutral. It's lovely, thank you. Barbara turned to Chris. Congratulations on another successful year. I'm sure the investors are very pleased. Some more than others, Chris said quietly, and Barbara caught the hint of worry in his tone. Well, Barbara said, setting down her empty champagne glass. I should mingle. Enjoy your evening. As she walked away, she heard Stacy's voice, pitched just loud enough to carry. She's not quite what I expected, so ordinary. Barbara's steps didn't falter, but her hands clenched into fists. The game was escalating, and Stacy had just made it personal. Across the room, she noticed a familiar figure entering the ballroom. Tall, distinguished, with steel-gray hair, and an aura of quiet power that made heads turn. John Hurd had arrived. And suddenly, Barbara realized that this night was far from over. The ballroom's atmosphere shifted the moment John Hurd stepped through the grand entrance. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips, and even the orchestra seemed to play a little softer, as if the very air had become charged with electricity. At 38, John commanded attention without trying. Tall and lean, with salt and pepper hair that spoke of wisdom rather than age, he moved through the crowd with the quiet confidence of a man who owned half of Manhattan, which, according to Forbes, wasn't far from the truth. His custom-tailored tuxedo was impeccable, but it was his eyes that truly captured attention, steel gray and sharp enough to cut glass. Barbara felt her breath catch as she watched him survey the room. She had met John Hurd exactly 4 months ago at a charity auction for children's literacy, an event she had attended alone while Chris was supposedly working late. The irony wasn't lost on her now that she knew he had been with Stacy that very evening. John's eyes found hers across the crowded ballroom, and his face lit up with genuine warmth. He began making his way toward her, politely declining introductions from eager socialites and business leaders who tried to intercept him. Barbara. His voice was warm honey over gravel as he approached. You look absolutely radiant. John, what a surprise. Barbara felt some of the evening's tension leave her shoulders. I didn't know you'd be here tonight. Last-minute decision. Richard Lawson mentioned it at lunch yesterday. Said it was always one of the city's premier charity events. His smile was knowing. Though I have to admit, the chance to see a friendly face in this sea of corporate sharks was certainly appealing. From the corner of her eye, Barbara noticed that their conversation was drawing attention. She spotted Chris across the room, his face darkening as he recognized John. Stacy was whispering something urgent in his ear, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his arm. Would you like some champagne? Barbara asked, gesturing toward the bar. Only if you'll join me. John offered his arm with old-world gallantry. As they walked toward the bar, Barbara was acutely aware of the whispers following in their wake. John Hurd's presence at a Vance Corporation event was news in itself. His company, Hurd Industries, was one of their biggest competitors. But John Hurd escorting Barbara Harris? That was front-page material. I have to ask, John said quietly as they approached the bar. Are you sure you're comfortable with this? I imagine my being here might complicate things for you. Barbara accepted a glass of champagne from the bartender and considered his question. 6 months ago, she would have worried about appearances, about what people might think, about protecting Chris's reputation even at the cost of her own happiness. But that woman had died the day she found Stacy's earring in her marital bed. John, she said, meeting his eyes directly, I stopped worrying about complications the day my husband brought his mistress to our anniversary dinner. John's expression darkened. He did what? It's a long story. Barbara sipped her champagne, feeling lighter than she had in months. The short version is that I'm no longer interested in making other people's lives easier at the expense of my own happiness. Good. John's voice held approval and something else, something that made Barbara's pulse quicken. Life's too short to spend it walking on eggshells around people who don't deserve your consideration. Barbara. They turned to see Eleanor Whitman approaching with a man Barbara didn't recognize, distinguished with silver hair and kind eyes. Eleanor, hello again. Barbara smiled warmly. I wanted you to meet my dear friend, Judge Hamilton Rothschild. Hamilton. This is Barbara Harris, the brilliant woman I was telling you about. Mrs. Harris. The judge took her hand with courtly grace. Eleanor speaks very highly of your work with the Literacy Foundation. Thank you, Your Honor. Though I'm afraid my involvement there has become somewhat limited recently. Ah, yes, I heard about the divorce. Nasty business, divorce, but sometimes necessary. His eyes twinkled with understanding. I presume this distinguished gentleman is John Hurd, Judge Rothschild. John shook the older man's hand firmly. A pleasure to meet you. The pleasure is mine. I've been following your company's renewable energy initiatives. Quite impressive work. As the conversation continued, Barbara found herself relaxing for the first time all evening. Here were people who valued her for who she was, not as an appendage to Chris Vance. John's presence beside her felt natural, protective without being possessive. If you'll excuse us, John said eventually. I believe they're starting the auction, and I promised Barbara I'd help her bid on that literacy program funding. Of course. Eleanor smiled knowingly. Enjoy yourselves. As they moved toward the auction area, John leaned close to Barbara's ear. I should mention, I haven't actually seen the auction catalog. Barbara laughed, the sound genuine and bright. Neither have I, but that was a masterful escape. I learned from the best. You handled that conversation beautifully. They found seats near the back of the auction area, far enough from the main action to speak quietly. Barbara was acutely aware of John's presence beside her, the subtle scent of his cologne, the way his sleeve brushed against her arm when he reached for the bidding paddle. May I ask you something? John said during a lull in the bidding. Of course. That night we met at the literacy auction. You seemed so sad. I wondered then what could make such a vibrant woman look so lost. His voice was gentle. I think I understand now. Barbara felt tears threaten but blinked them back. I was already lost by then. I just didn't know it yet. And now? Barbara looked around the ballroom, at the glittering lights, the elegant crowd, the world she had once thought was hers. Then she looked at John, at his honest gray eyes and patient smile. Now I think I'm finally ready to be found. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a sharp crack, but Barbara barely heard it, because across the room she could see Chris staring at them with an expression she had never seen before. Something raw and desperate and utterly too late. The real game was about to begin. The auction had ended with a flourish. John had successfully bid on a weekend at a private vineyard in Napa Valley, ostensibly for the Literacy Foundation, but with a knowing smile that suggested other intentions. As the crowd began to disperse and mingle again, Barbara found herself standing beside him, feeling more alive than she had in months. That was quite generous of you, she said, watching as the auction staff tagged his winning bid. It's for a good cause. John's eyes held a hint of mischief. Though I have to admit, I'm hoping you might help me ensure the donation is put to good use. Perhaps over dinner sometime? Before Barbara could respond, a shadow fell across them. Chris approached with determined strides, his jaw set in a way Barbara recognized from their marriage. He was about to make a scene. Heard. Chris's voice was carefully controlled, but Barbara could hear the undercurrent of anger. Vance. John's tone was equally measured, but held no warmth. Congratulations on another successful gala. Though I have to say, the company tonight has been exceptional. He glanced meaningfully at Barbara. Chris's face flushed slightly. I wasn't aware you'd be attending tonight. This is typically an event for Vance Corporation clients and partners. Well, John smiled coolly. Richard Lawson was kind enough to extend an invitation. Something about exploring potential collaborations. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Barbara saw Chris's hands clench into fists at his sides. Richard Lawson was the chairman of Vance Corporation's board. If he was courting John Hurd for business partnerships, it meant he was actively working around Chris. Richard didn't mention any meetings, Chris said tightly. No? How odd. John's expression was the picture of innocence. Perhaps it slipped his mind. You know how these things are. So many moving pieces in the business world. Barbara watched the exchange with fascination. She had rarely seen Chris outmaneuvered so elegantly, and she was beginning to understand why John Hurd had built such a formidable empire. Chris, darling, there you are. Stacy materialized beside Chris, slightly breathless and with her smile a touch too bright. She had clearly been searching for him, and her relief at finding him was poorly concealed. The photographer from Manhattan Elite wants to take some photos of us, she continued, sliding her arm through Chris's, for their society page spread next month. Not now, Stacy, Chris said without taking his eyes off John. But darling, they're waiting. And the lighting is perfect right now. Stacy stopped mid-sentence as she noticed Barbara and John standing together. Her smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. Oh, hello again. And you must be... She looked at John expectantly. John Hurd, he said, extending his hand politely but without warmth. Stacy's eyes widened slightly. Even she recognized the name. The John Hurd? Of Hurd Industries? Her voice held a note of uncertainty that Barbara had never heard before. Guilty as charged. John's smile was polite but distant. How interesting that you're here tonight, Stacy said, clearly struggling to regain her composure. I mean, at a Vance Corporation event. Business makes for strange bedfellows, John replied smoothly. Though in this case I'd say I'm here for much more pleasant reasons. He glanced at Barbara with unmistakable warmth. The implications hit Stacy like a physical blow. Her face went pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, and she looked between Barbara and John with dawning comprehension. I see, she said slowly. Well, isn't that cozy? Stacy. Chris's voice held a warning. No, it's fine, Barbara said, her voice steady. Stacy's just surprised to see that some people value intelligence and character over youth and availability. The words were delivered with surgical precision, and Stacy's face flushed red. For a moment, her mask slipped entirely, revealing the calculating woman beneath the pretty facade. At least I don't have to buy my companionship, Stacy snapped. The insult hung in the air like poison. Barbara felt John tense beside her, but before he could speak, Eleanor Whitman appeared as if from nowhere. Barbara, dear, Judge Rothschild wanted to introduce you to his wife. She's organizing a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital and specifically requested to meet you. Eleanor's timing was impeccable, offering Barbara a graceful escape from the increasingly toxic conversation. Of course, Barbara said smoothly. She turned to John. Would you care to join us? I'd be delighted, John replied, offering his arm. As they walked away, Barbara could feel Chris's eyes burning into her back. She caught fragments of heated whispers between him and Stacy, their voices barely contained. Told you to keep your mouth shut. She was insulting me. You have no idea what you've just done. Eleanor guided them to a quiet corner where an elegant woman in her 60s waited with a warm smile. Mrs. Harris, she said, extending her hand. I'm Margaret Rothschild. My husband has told me so much about your work with literacy programs. As Barbara fell into conversation with Mrs. Rothschild, she noticed John watching her with an expression of admiration and something deeper. She also noticed the room's subtle shift in energy. People were beginning to choose sides, and the evening's alliances were becoming clear. Near the bar, she spotted Richard Lawson in deep conversation with several board members, their expressions serious. Janet Morrison was holding court with a group of investors' wives, no doubt spreading tonight's gossip with surgical precision. And across the room, Chris stood alone for a moment while Stacy posed for photographers, her smile brittle and forced. He looked lost, uncertain, emotions Barbara had rarely seen him display during their marriage. Mrs. Harris, Mrs. Rothschild was saying, I do hope you'll consider joining our board. We need more people with your vision and integrity. I would be honored, Barbara replied, meaning it. For too long, she had defined herself by her relationship to Chris. Tonight, she was remembering who she had been before she became Mrs. Vance. As the evening progressed, Barbara found herself at the center of a different kind of attention, not as the discarded wife making a scene, but as an intelligent, accomplished woman worthy of respect and partnership. And with each conversation, each introduction, each moment of genuine connection, the life she had built around Chris Vance seemed smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror. The real question was, would Chris realize what he was losing before it was too late? Judging by the increasingly desperate glances he kept shooting in her direction, he was beginning to understand. But understanding and being able to fix the damage were two very different things. The evening had reached that magical hour when champagne had loosened tongues, and the ballroom's golden lights cast everything in a warm, forgiving glow. But beneath the surface elegance, Barbara could feel the undercurrents of tension pulling everyone in different directions. She stood near the terrace doors, enjoying a moment of relative quiet, while John spoke with Judge Rothschild about some legal matter. The fresh air from the partially opened doors was a welcome relief from the increasingly stifling atmosphere inside. Barbara. She turned to find Chris approaching alone, his face drawn with exhaustion and something that looked almost like panic. Stacy was nowhere in sight, probably still posing for the society photographers. Chris. Her voice was neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile. Can we talk? Please. Just for a minute. His usual commanding presence seemed diminished, almost fragile. Barbara glanced around the ballroom. They were partially hidden by a large floral arrangement but still visible to anyone who cared to look. I suppose we can talk here. Chris stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, the same scent that had once made her feel safe and loved. Now it just made her sad. You look beautiful tonight, he said quietly. But then, you always did. I stopped noticing. Chris, what do you want? Barbara's patience was wearing thin. I want to explain. About Stacy, about everything. I know how it looks bringing her here tonight, but how it looks? Barbara's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. Chris, you didn't just bring your mistress to a public event. You brought the woman you were sleeping with while we were married to an event celebrating the company we built together. Chris flinched as if she'd slapped him. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. The divorce, the separation, none of it was supposed to be this messy. Then you shouldn't have made it messy. Barbara looked at him with something approaching pity. Did you really think you could have both? The perfect wife at home and the exciting mistress on the side? I made a mistake. No, Chris. A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk on the way home. What you did was make a choice. Every time you lied to me, every time you met her while I thought you were working late, every time you came home to me after being with her, those were all choices. Chris's face crumpled. I know, and I've regretted it every single day since you left. Barbara, please, I know I don't deserve it, but, Barbara, there you are. John's voice cut through Chris's words as he approached, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes alert to the tension in the air. John. Barbara felt a wave of relief. Judge Rothschild finished his story. Indeed, fascinating case about maritime law, though I suspect you might find it less riveting than I did. John's eyes flicked to Chris with polite acknowledgement. Vance, we were just finishing our conversation, Chris said tightly. Actually, Barbara said, stepping closer to John, we were just starting ours. John, didn't you mention something about getting some air on the terrace? I did indeed. John offered his arm with a smile. The view of the city from here is supposed to be spectacular. As they moved toward the terrace doors, Barbara heard Chris call her name once more, but she didn't turn around. She had spent too many years of her marriage looking back, trying to fix things that were already broken. The terrace was a revelation, a small slice of paradise 30 floors above the city streets. Fairy lights twinkled in the small trees that lined the space, and the Manhattan skyline spread out before them like scattered diamonds on black velvet. Thank you, Barbara said once they were alone. For what? For the rescue. I'm not sure how much longer I could have maintained my composure. John leaned against the stone balustrade, studying her face in the soft light. You seem to be handling yourself quite well. What did he want? Barbara joined him at the railing, looking out over the city. To explain, to apologize, to somehow make me understand why he threw away our marriage, for a woman who sees dollar signs when she looks at him. And do you? Understand, I mean? Barbara was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. I understand that he was bored, that I became predictable, comfortable, that Stacy made him feel young and exciting again. She turned to face John. What I don't understand is how he could think any of that was worth destroying what we had. What did you have? Security, partnership, a life built together. Barbara paused. But not passion, not for a long time. John moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes. And now? Now I'm learning that there's a difference between being safe and being happy. Barbara. John's voice was soft, serious. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. All right. Are you here with me tonight because you want to be, or because you want to hurt him? The question hit her like a physical blow. Barbara stared at John, recognizing the courage it had taken to ask it and the kindness that had motivated it. Both, she said finally. At first it was both, but John. She reached out to touch his hand. What I feel when I'm with you has nothing to do with Chris. You make me remember who I was before I became half of someone else's equation. John's thumb traced across her knuckles. Good, because what I feel for you has nothing to do with your ex-husband either. Through the terrace doors, Barbara could see the ballroom continuing its elegant dance. Couples swayed on the dance floor. Business deals were struck over champagne, and somewhere in that glittering crowd, Chris was probably looking for her while Stacy smiled for more photos. Would you like to dance? John asked suddenly. Barbara looked back at the ballroom, then at John. Out here? Why not? Better music anyway. He gestured toward his phone, where soft jazz had begun playing. Plus no audience. Actually, Barbara said, glancing through the glass doors where she could see several people watching them. I think we have quite an audience. John followed her gaze and smiled. Well then, we'd better give them something worth watching. As he pulled her into his arms, Barbara felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of chains she hadn't even realized she'd been wearing. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about what people expected of her, what was proper, what was safe. She was thinking about what she wanted, and what she wanted was to stop hiding. As they swayed together under the fairy lights, with Manhattan glittering below them and half the city's elite watching through glass doors, Barbara Harris finally stopped looking over her shoulder at the life she was leaving behind. She was ready to face forward. The only question was how far she was willing to go. The soft jazz from John's phone mixed with the distant sounds of the gala, creating an intimate bubble around them on the terrace. Barbara moved in John's arms with a grace she had forgotten she possessed, feeling lighter with each step. Through the glass doors she could see faces turned their way, some curious, some shocked, all riveted by the sight of the city's newest power couple dancing under the stars. You realize, John murmured, his breath warm against her ear, that by tomorrow morning this will be in every society column in the city. Good, Barbara replied, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. I'm tired of hiding. Are you sure? Once we cross this line, there's no going back to being the quiet ex-wife who fades into the background. Barbara pulled back slightly to look into his eyes. In them, she saw everything Chris had never offered her. Respect, genuine interest, the promise of partnership rather than possession. I was never meant to fade into the background, she said. I just forgot that for a while. The song was ending, but neither of them made any move to separate. Instead, John's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing along her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. Barbara, he said softly, I want you to know that whatever happens after tonight, this isn't a game to me. You're not a game to me. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, feel it in the careful way he held her. I know, she whispered. That's what makes you different. And then, as if pulled by some invisible force, they moved toward each other. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, a question rather than a demand. But as Barbara felt John's lips against hers, something inside her chest burst open like a flower blooming in fast motion. This was what a kiss was supposed to feel like, not an obligation or a habit, but a choice made freely, passionately, without reservation. She kissed him back with years of suppressed longing, not for him specifically, but for the feeling of being truly wanted, truly cherished. Her arms wound around his neck and she felt him pull her closer, deepening the kiss until the rest of the world melted away. Inside the ballroom, the reaction was immediate and electric. Chris, who had been searching for Barbara throughout the ballroom, finally spotted her through the terrace doors just as John's lips met hers. The champagne glass in his hand slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering on the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire room. His face went chalk white, then flushed red, then white again. He stood frozen, paralyzed by the sight of his ex-wife in another man's arms. Not just any man, but John Hurd, the billionaire who could buy and sell Chris's company without breaking a sweat. Oh my God, someone whispered nearby. Is that Barbara Harris? With John Hurd came another voice, filled with amazement. Look at Chris Vance's face, a third person murmured. He looks like he's about to be sick. The whispers spread through the ballroom like wildfire. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as people turned to stare, first at the couple on the terrace, then at Chris's stricken expression. Margaret Sinclair grabbed her husband's arm. Robert, are you seeing this? Everyone's seeing this, he replied grimly. This is going to be front-page news tomorrow. Near the bar, Richard Lawson allowed himself a small smile. If Barbara Harris, intelligent, well-connected, and apparently now romantically linked to John Hurd, was moving in their social circles again, it could only benefit his own business interests. But it was Stacy's reaction that was perhaps the most telling of all. She had been posing for photographs near the main entrance when the commotion started. Following everyone's gaze to the terrace, she saw Barbara and John locked in their passionate embrace, and her perfectly made-up face contorted with rage. This is ridiculous, she hissed to the photographer. Why is everyone staring at them? She's nobody. But even as she said it, Stacy could see that Barbara Harris was far from nobody. She was the woman commanding the attention of every person in the room, the woman who had just publicly claimed the city's most eligible billionaire, the woman who was making Stacy's own victory seem suddenly hollow. Chris, meanwhile, had not moved from his spot near the shattered champagne glass. His eyes remained fixed on the terrace, watching as Barbara and John slowly separated, their faces glowing with happiness and possibility. "Sir?" A waiter appeared at his elbow. "Are you all right? Should I get someone to clean up this glass?" Chris didn't answer. He couldn't answer. Because in that moment, watching Barbara smile at John Hurd with a radiance he hadn't seen in years, Chris Vance finally understood what he had lost. Not just a wife, not just a marriage, but the woman who had once looked at him the way she was now looking at John, with complete trust, genuine affection, and the promise of a future built together. On the terrace, Barbara was becoming aware of the attention they had drawn. She could see the faces pressed against the glass, could almost feel the collective held breath of Manhattan's elite. "We've certainly given them something to talk about," she said, though she made no move to step away from John's embrace. "Indeed we have." John's smile was confident, unapologetic. "Any regrets?" Barbara looked through the glass doors one more time, meeting Chris's stricken gaze across the crowded ballroom. For a moment, she felt a flicker of the old sympathy, the old urge to protect him from embarrassment. But then she remembered all the nights she had waited up for him, all the lies he had told her, all the times she had made herself smaller to accommodate his needs and his reputation. "None whatsoever," she said firmly. John's grin was brilliant. "Good, because I have a feeling this is just the beginning." As they walked back toward the ballroom doors hand in hand, Barbara held her head high. She was done apologizing for taking up space in the world, done making herself invisible to spare other people's feelings. The old Barbara Harris might have slipped quietly out a side door to avoid the stares and whispers. But the new Barbara Harris? She was ready to face whatever came next, even if it meant walking through a ballroom full of people who couldn't decide whether to congratulate her or console her ex-husband. Especially then, the ballroom had transformed into a theater of whispers and stolen glances. As Barbara and John re-entered hand in hand, the crowd seemed to part before them like the Red Sea, creating a natural pathway through the elegant chaos they had unleashed. Barbara could feel the weight of every gaze, hear the rustle of silk dresses as women leaned close to share gossip, see the calculating looks of businessmen already wondering how this development might affect their own interests. But for the first time in years, she felt no urge to shrink from the attention. "Mrs. Harris." Richard Lawson materialized before them, his smile genuinely warm. "What a delightful surprise to see you here tonight. And looking so radiant, if I may say so." "Mr. Lawson." Barbara's voice was steady, confident. "Thank you. I was just telling John how much I've missed these events." The chairman's eyes shifted to John with newfound respect. "Mr. Hurd, I do hope you're enjoying the evening. Perhaps we could arrange that lunch meeting we discussed." "I'd be delighted," John replied smoothly. "My assistant will call yours Monday morning." As they moved through the crowd, Barbara noticed the subtle but unmistakable shift in how people reacted to her. Where once she had been treated as Chris's appendage, now she was being acknowledged as a person of substance in her own right. The woman who had captured John Hurd's attention was someone worth knowing. Eleanor Whitman appeared at her elbow, eyes twinkling with delight. "My dear, that was absolutely magnificent. The whole room is buzzing." "Is that good or bad?" Barbara asked, though her tone suggested she no longer particularly cared about the answer. "In my experience," Eleanor said with a conspiratorial smile, "anything that gets people talking is usually good for business. And judging by the number of people who want to meet you tonight, I'd say you're about to become very busy." She was right. Over the next hour, Barbara found herself surrounded by people she had barely spoken to during her marriage. Board members' wives who suddenly wanted her opinion on charity events, business leaders interested in her thoughts on social initiatives, society matrons eager to include her in their circles. John remained by her side throughout, never possessive, but clearly protective, his presence lending her additional gravitas. Barbara watched him work the room with the skill of someone born to it, and she realized she was seeing a master class in how power really operated in their world. "Barbara," the voice came from behind her, soft and desperate. She turned to find Chris standing alone, his usually perfect appearance disheveled. His tie was askew, there were stress lines around his eyes she had never noticed before, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached toward her. "Chris." Her voice was neither warm nor cold, simply neutral. Can we please talk? Privately? His eyes flicked to John, who had stepped slightly closer but remained diplomatically silent. I think we've said everything that needs to be said, Barbara replied calmly. No, we haven't. Please. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. Barbara looked at John, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod. The decision was hers to make. 5 minutes, she agreed. But here, not somewhere private. We're past the point of private conversations. Chris's face flushed, but he nodded. Barbara, what you're doing tonight, it's not you. You're not vindictive, you're not cruel. This is about hurting me, isn't it? Chris, Barbara said quietly, this has nothing to do with you. How can you say that? You show up here with him, he gestured toward John, kissing him where everyone can see, making a spectacle. Making a spectacle? Barbara's voice remained level, but there was steel underneath. I kissed a man I care about. The fact that it embarrasses you is your problem, not mine. You care about him? Chris's voice cracked slightly. Barbara, you barely know him. We were married for 8 years. 8 years. Doesn't that mean anything? It meant everything, Barbara said, and for a moment her composure wavered. That's why what you did hurt so much. I know I hurt you. I know I made mistakes. You made choices, Chris. We've been through this. Then make a choice now. Choose us. Choose our marriage. Choose to forgive me. His voice was raw with desperation. I'll end things with Stacy tonight. We can go to counseling, start over, make it work. Barbara stared at him, this man she had once loved so completely, and felt something break free inside her chest. Not her heart, that had been broken months ago. Something else, the last chain that had bound her to the woman she used to be. Chris, she said gently, I don't want to make it work. I want to be happy. The words hit him like a physical blow. He actually staggered backward, his face going pale. And I'm happy now, Barbara continued. For the first time in years, I'm happy. I'm not going to give that up to go back to being someone's afterthought. You were never an afterthought. I was exactly an afterthought. You thought about Stacy first, your needs first, your wants first. I was what you came home to when everything else was finished. Barbara's voice remained steady, but her words cut deep. I deserved better than that. I deserve better than that. Chris opened his mouth to argue, but no words came, because somewhere in his chest, he knew she was right. Across the room, Stacy had been watching the conversation with increasing agitation. Finally, she could stand it no longer and marched over, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Chris, darling, what's taking so long? People are starting to stare. She slid her arm through his possessively, but her smile was brittle. They're already staring, Barbara observed mildly. The question is what they're thinking about what they see. Stacy's mask slipped for a moment, revealing the calculating woman beneath. They're thinking that some people can't handle being replaced gracefully. Or, John said, speaking for the first time, his voice pleasant but dangerous, they're thinking that some people mistake being young for being valuable, and being beautiful for being irreplaceable. The words hung in the air like ice. Stacy's face flushed red, then white as the implications sank in. Come on, Stacy, Chris said quietly, his voice defeated. Let's go. As they walked away, Barbara could hear Stacy's urgent whispers, her demands for explanation, her growing panic as she began to understand that the evening had not gone according to plan. Well, John said once they were out of earshot. That was illuminating. Was it terrible of me? Barbara asked, watching Chris's retreating figure. He looked so lost. He made his choices, John replied, echoing her earlier words. Just as you're making yours. Barbara nodded, squaring her shoulders. Around them, the party continued, but she could feel the shift in the room's energy. The old order had been challenged tonight, and everyone was still figuring out what the new one would look like. But for the first time in years, Barbara Harris wasn't afraid of change. She was ready to help write the next chapter. 3 weeks after the gala, the reverberations were still rippling through Manhattan's elite circles, like stones thrown into a pristine pond. Barbara sat in her new apartment, an elegant 2-bedroom overlooking Central Park that she had purchased with her divorce settlement, reading the morning papers over coffee. The New York Times business section featured a small but significant item. Hurd Industries announces strategic partnership with Lawson Holdings. Barbara smiled as she read the details. Richard Lawson had wasted no time capitalizing on his connection to John, and the partnership would give Hurd Industries a significant foothold in several markets that directly competed with Vance Corporation. Her phone buzzed with a text from John. Dinner tonight? I have news to share. Before she could respond, her doorbell rang. Through the intercom, she heard a familiar voice. "Barbara, it's Margaret Sinclair. I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced." Margaret entered the apartment looking uncharacteristically flustered, her usually perfect composure showing cracks around the edges. "Margaret, what's wrong?" Barbara guided her to the living room, noting the stress lines around her friend's eyes. "It's about the company. About Chris." Margaret accepted the coffee Barbara offered with shaking hands. "Robert came home last night looking like he'd aged 10 years. There was an emergency board meeting yesterday." Barbara felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of emergency?" "The loss in partnership with John Hurd isn't the only problem. 3 of our biggest clients have decided not to renew their contracts. Janet Morrison's husband pulled his investment fund's business entirely." Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. "They're saying it's because they've lost confidence in Chris's judgment." "His judgment about what?" "Everything. His personal life, his business decisions, his ability to maintain stable relationships." Margaret looked directly at Barbara. Bringing Stacy to the gala was apparently the final straw for a lot of people. They saw it as unprofessional. Barbara set down her coffee cup carefully. She had expected some fallout, but not this extensive. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that Richard Lawson is calling for a vote of no confidence. They want to remove Chris as CEO." The words hung in the air between them. Barbara felt a complex mix of emotions. Satisfaction that Chris was finally facing consequences for his actions, but also a twinge of the old sympathy that was so hard to shake. "There's more," Margaret continued reluctantly. "Stacy has been difficult. She's been calling herself the future Mrs. Vance, talking about redecorating the corporate offices, making demands about being included in business dinners. She even showed up at the office last week and tried to attend a board meeting." Barbara couldn't help it. She laughed. "She tried to attend a board meeting?" "Walked right in like she belonged there. Richard had security escort her out." Margaret's expression was grim, but the damage was done. Every board member saw it, and word spread quickly. "People are saying Chris has lost control of his personal life, so how can he be trusted to control a multi-billion-dollar company?" After Margaret left, Barbara found herself staring out at Central Park, processing the information. She had wanted Chris to face consequences for his actions, but watching his professional life crumble felt more complicated than she had expected. Her phone rang, John's name on the screen. "I was just about to text you back," she said by way of greeting. "Barbara, we need to talk. Can I come over?" An hour later, John sat across from her in her living room, his expression serious. "I assume you've heard about Vance Corporation's troubles," he began. "Margaret Sinclair just filled me in. The board is calling for a vote of no confidence." John nodded. "That's part of what I wanted to discuss. Barbara, I need you to know that none of this was planned. The Lawson partnership was legitimate business, not some scheme to hurt Chris." "I know that," Barbara said, though she wondered if John was being entirely honest. "But," John continued, "I also won't pretend I'm sorry to see him facing consequences. What he did to you was inexcusable, and the way he's handled his relationship with that woman shows a profound lack of judgment." Barbara studied his face. "There's something else, isn't there?" John was quiet for a moment. "Richard Lawson approached me yesterday. He wants me to consider taking over as CEO if they succeed in removing Chris." The words hit Barbara like a physical blow. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd think about it." John leaned forward, taking her hands in his. "But Barbara, I need you to know that my feelings for you have nothing to do with business. Whether I take that position or not, what's between us is real." Barbara looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of deception. What she saw was sincerity, but also ambition, and she realized that in John's world the two weren't mutually exclusive. "Would you take it?" she asked. "Probably," he admitted. "It's a good company with smart people who've been hurt by poor leadership. I could turn it around." Barbara nodded slowly. She couldn't blame him for the opportunity. Business was business, and Chris had created his own problems. But it did make her wonder about the timing of their relationship, about whether she was a happy coincidence or part of a larger strategy. "I understand," she said finally. That evening, as Barbara dressed for dinner, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. 3 weeks ago, she had been the discarded wife, publicly humiliated and struggling to find her footing. Now she was the woman who had captured the heart of Manhattan's most eligible billionaire, who was being courted by charity boards and society hostesses, who commanded respect in her own right. The transformation should have felt triumphant, and in many ways it did. But as she applied her lipstick, the same shade she had worn to the gala, Barbara couldn't shake the feeling that she was still, in some ways, defined by her relationship to the men in her life. First Chris's wife, now John's girlfriend. The question was, who was Barbara Harris when she stood alone? She was about to find out because tomorrow morning, she had an interview with the board of the Metropolitan Children's Hospital. They wanted her to consider taking over as director of their development program, a position that would put her in charge of a $50 million fundraising campaign. It would be her first major professional role since her divorce. Her first chance to prove that she was more than just someone's ex-wife or current girlfriend. Her first opportunity to discover who she really was when the spotlight was hers alone. As she grabbed her purse and headed for the door, Barbara felt a flutter of excitement mixed with nervousness. Chris had given her security, and then taken it away. John was offering her passion and possibility, but the hospital board was offering her something else entirely, the chance to build something that was entirely her own, and that, she was beginning to realize, might be the most valuable gift of all. 2 months after the gala, Barbara stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new office on the 30th floor of the Metropolitan Children's Hospital Administrative Building. The city sprawled below her, and for the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The morning papers lay scattered across her mahogany desk, and the headlines told a story she was still getting used to. Barbara Harris raises $8 million in first 2 months as development director, and former Mrs. Vance emerges as philanthropic powerhouse. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Harris, her assistant Amy, peered around the door. Your 10 o'clock is here. Mrs. Elizabeth Carnegie from the Carnegie Foundation. Barbara straightened her navy blue suit jacket and smiled. Send her in, please. The meeting went better than she had dared hope. Mrs. Carnegie, a woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, had come to discuss a potential partnership that could bring another $8 million to the hospital's new pediatric wing. I have to say, Mrs. Harris, Mrs. Carnegie said as they wrapped up, when I first heard about your appointment, I wasn't sure what to expect. But your vision for this program is exactly what philanthropy needs. Strategic, sustainable, and genuinely impactful. After Mrs. Carnegie left, Barbara allowed herself a moment of pure satisfaction. This success was hers alone, not reflected glory from a husband's achievements or enhanced by a boyfriend's connections. She had earned it through her own intelligence, hard work, and genuine passion for the cause. Her phone buzzed with a text from John. Dinner tonight to celebrate your Carnegie meeting? I heard it went brilliantly. Before she could respond, Amy appeared in her doorway again, looking uncomfortable. Mrs. Harris, there's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's urgent. A Miss Hyduke? Barbara's blood chilled. Stacy was the last person she expected, or wanted to see, especially here, in her professional sanctuary. Send her in, Barbara said after a moment, but leave the door open. Stacy entered the office like a storm cloud, her usually perfect appearance showing signs of strain. Her designer clothes were immaculate as always, but there were dark circles under her eyes that even expert makeup couldn't entirely conceal, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her purse. Stacy, Barbara said evenly, remaining seated behind her desk. This is unexpected. I need to talk to you. Stacy's voice lacked its usual confidence. About Chris. About everything. I can't imagine what we have to discuss about my ex-husband. Stacy moved closer to the desk, her composure cracking. You have to call them off. The board members, the investors, everyone who's trying to destroy him. You have influence now. I see it in the papers. The way people talk about you. Make them stop. Barbara studied the younger woman with something approaching pity. Stacy, I think you've misunderstood something fundamental. I don't control what the board does. Chris's professional troubles are the result of his own choices. That's not true. Stacy's voice rose. Then she caught herself and glanced toward the open door. This all started after that night at the gala. After you kissed that man in front of everyone. You planned this whole thing to humiliate Chris. I kissed John because I wanted to. Nothing more, nothing less. Don't lie to me. Stacy's mask slipped entirely. You couldn't stand that he chose me over you, so you decided to destroy his life. Well, congratulations. You're succeeding. Barbara leaned back in her chair, genuinely curious. How exactly am I destroying his life by building my own? By making him look like a fool? By parading around with John Hurd, getting your name in the papers, making everyone think... Stacy stopped abruptly. Making everyone think what? Stacy's face flushed red. making everyone think that he left someone valuable for someone less valuable. The admission hung in the air between them. Barbara felt a moment of genuine sympathy for the younger woman. Stacy was beginning to understand that in her world, being young and beautiful wasn't enough if you lacked substance. "Stacy," Barbara said gently, "what exactly do you want from me?" "I want you to go away." The words came out in a rush. "Leave New York. Stop seeing John Hurd. Stop making Chris look bad by comparison. I'll pay you. I have jewelry, savings. You want to pay me to disappear?" Barbara couldn't hide her amazement. "Yes, name your price. Whatever Chris gave you in the divorce, I'll double it." Barbara stood slowly, walking around her desk to face Stacy directly. "And why would you think I'd be interested in your money?" "Because everyone has a price," Stacy said desperately. "Because you're just trying to make him jealous anyway, right? To get him back? Well, it's not working. He's mine now, and I'm not giving him up." Barbara looked at this woman who had helped destroy her marriage, who had walked into her life and taken what she thought she wanted and felt only exhaustion. "Stacy, I need you to understand something," Barbara said quietly. "I don't want Chris back. I never did. What you're seeing in the papers, my relationship with John, this job, none of it has anything to do with Chris. I've moved on. I don't believe you. That's your choice. But I think you should consider the possibility that Chris's problems aren't my fault. Maybe clients are pulling their business because they don't trust a CEO who brings his mistress to board functions. Maybe investors are concerned because he seems to have lost his judgment. Maybe the people who matter in his professional world don't respect a man who publicly humiliated his wife of 8 years. Stacy's face went pale. "He didn't humiliate you. He fell in love. He cheated on his wife and then flaunted his mistress at public events. That's not love, Stacy, that's selfishness." "You're wrong." But Stacy's voice lacked conviction. "Maybe, but here's what I know for certain. I'm happy, genuinely happy. And that has nothing to do with Chris, and everything to do with finally figuring out who I am when I'm not trying to be what someone else needs." Stacy stared at her for a long moment, and Barbara could see the younger woman's worldview shifting, cracking under the weight of reality. "The board meeting is next week," Stacy said suddenly. "The vote of no confidence. I know. If they remove him as CEO, we'll have to sell the penthouse, my car, everything." Stacy's voice was small, defeated. I knew there might be some drama, but I thought it would blow over. I thought people would just accept us eventually. Some choices have consequences that last longer than we expect," Barbara said, not unkindly. Stacy turned to leave, then stopped at the door. "For what it's worth," she said without turning around, "I am sorry. About the way it happened. About hurting you." "Thank you," Barbara said, meaning it. "That actually does mean something." After Stacy left, Barbara returned to her desk and picked up her phone to text John back. "Dinner sounds perfect. I have a lot to tell you." As she looked out at the city again, Barbara realized that for the first time since her divorce, she felt genuinely sorry for Chris. Not because of his business troubles, those were his own making, but because he had convinced himself that what he had with Stacy was worth destroying what he had with her. He was about to learn the difference between love and infatuation, between partnership and possession, between a woman who wanted to build something with him and one who simply wanted to own his success. It was a lesson that would cost him everything, but it was no longer Barbara's problem to solve. The boardroom of Vance Corporation had never felt so cold. Barbara sat in the gallery section, having been invited by Richard Lawson to witness what he called a historic moment in corporate governance. Around the mahogany table, 12 board members sat with folders open before them, their faces grave as they prepared to vote on Chris's future. It had been 6 months since the gala, and the transformation in everyone's lives had been complete and irreversible. Chris sat at the head of the table, his usual commanding presence reduced to a shadow of its former self. His hair had gone prematurely gray at the temples, his custom suits hung looser on his frame, and the confident smile that had once charmed investors and colleagues alike was nowhere to be seen. Beside him sat his attorney. Stacy was notably absent. "Before we proceed with the vote," Richard Lawson said, his voice carrying across the silent room, "I want to review the facts that have brought us to this point. In the past 6 months, Vance Corporation has lost 37% of its client base, suffered a 42% drop in stock price, and failed to secure any new major partnerships." Chris's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "Furthermore," Richard continued, "the CEO's personal conduct has repeatedly brought negative attention to the company. culminating in incidents that have damaged our reputation with both clients and investors. From her seat in the gallery, Barbara watched Chris's face as each devastating statistic was read aloud. She felt a complex mixture of emotions: sadness for the man she had once loved, satisfaction that justice was being served, and relief that she was no longer tied to his sinking ship. "Mr. Vance," Richard said formally, "do you have anything to say before we vote?" Chris stood slowly, his hands gripping the back of his chair. "6 months ago, I made some personal choices that I now realize were mistakes. I allowed my private life to interfere with my professional judgment, and I take full responsibility for the consequences." He paused, his eyes finding Barbara's across the room. For a moment the years fell away, and she saw a glimpse of the man she had married, vulnerable, uncertain, desperately trying to find his way back from a cliff he had walked off voluntarily. "I built this company from nothing," Chris continued, his voice gaining strength. "Every success we've achieved, every dollar we've earned for our investors, every job we've created, I was part of that. I am part of that." "Were," corrected Janet Morrison's husband from his seat at the table. "Past tense, Mr. Vance. The question now is whether you can be part of our future." Chris's composure cracked slightly. "I'm asking for another chance. I'm asking you to remember what I've accomplished, not just what I've lost in the past few months." The silence that followed was deafening. "All in favor of removing Christopher Vance as Chief Executive Officer of Vance Corporation," Richard said quietly. One by one, hands rose around the table. Barbara counted them. 8, 9, 10. Chris needed at least 7 votes to retain his position. He got 2. "The motion passes," Richard announced. "Christopher Vance is hereby removed as CEO, effective immediately." Chris sat down heavily, his face ashen. Around the table, board members were already discussing transition plans, but Barbara barely heard them. She was watching Chris, watching the moment when a powerful man realized that power was not permanent, that choices had consequences, and that some mistakes could not be undone. After the meeting, Barbara found herself in the elevator with Chris. They rode in tense silence for several floors before he finally spoke. "Congratulations," he said bitterly. "I hope you're satisfied now." Barbara didn't respond, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor numbers. "You destroyed everything," Chris continued, his voice growing sharper. "My company, my reputation, my life, all because you couldn't handle being replaced." "I didn't destroy anything," Barbara said calmly. "You did that yourself, by falling in love, by choosing someone who actually wanted to be with me instead of going through the motions." Barbara finally looked at him, and what she saw was a man consumed by his own bitterness, unable to accept responsibility for his choices. "You chose to cheat. You chose to lie. You chose to bring your mistress to public events. Those were your decisions, Chris. The consequences are yours, too." The elevator doors opened, and Chris stepped out into the lobby. Before the doors could close, he turned back with a look of pure resentment. "You think you've won, but look what it cost everyone. I hope your precious new life was worth destroying so many others." The doors closed on his angry face, and Barbara felt only relief that she would never have to endure his self-pity again. That evening, Barbara stood in John's penthouse apartment, looking out at the city lights while he opened a bottle of champagne. "To new beginnings," he said, offering her a glass. "To new beginnings," she agreed, but her mind was elsewhere. "You're thinking about him," John observed, settling beside her on the couch. "I'm thinking about all of it. 6 months ago, I was the discarded wife with no identity outside of my marriage. Tonight, I'm the director of a major hospital foundation. I'm in love with a man who respects me, and my ex-husband just lost everything because he couldn't appreciate what he had." Having second thoughts, Barbara looked at John, really looked at him. He was handsome, successful, intelligent, and genuinely caring. He had stood by her during her transformation, supported her career goals, and never once tried to make her smaller to fit his needs. "None whatsoever," she said firmly. "I'm just processing. This morning I approved funding for a new children's cancer ward. This afternoon I watched my ex-husband lose his life's work. This evening I'm drinking champagne with a man who loves me for who I am, not who he wants me to be." "It's been quite a day," John agreed. "It's been quite a year." Barbara curled up against his side, feeling safe and valued in a way she had forgotten was possible. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd met before I was married?" "Sometimes," John admitted. "But then I think that you might not have been ready for me then." Pain has a way of teaching us what we really need. Barbara considered this, thinking about the woman she had been a year ago. Insecure, accommodating, willing to accept crumbs of affection rather than demand the full meal. That woman would never have had the courage to kiss John on a public terrace, would never have taken a job that put her in the spotlight, would never have walked away from a powerful man's desperate pleas. Her phone buzzed with a text message. The sender's name made her stomach tighten. Stacy, this is all your fault. You couldn't stand that he chose me, so you turned everyone against us. I hope you're happy now that you've ruined everything. Barbara showed the message to John, who read it with a grimace. Still blaming everyone else, I see, he said. Some people never learn, Barbara replied, deleting the message without responding. She'll probably spend the rest of her life convinced that she was the victim in all of this. The fact that Stacy still couldn't see her own role in the destruction only confirmed that Barbara had been right to cut all ties. Some people were simply incapable of growth. So, John said, refilling their champagne glasses, what happens now? Now that all the drama is over and we can just be us? Barbara smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. Now we get to find out who we are when we're not defined by other people's choices. Now we get to build something that's entirely ours. I like the sound of that, John said, pulling her closer. As they sat together in comfortable silence, Barbara reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had been broken by betrayal. 6 months ago, she had been humiliated at a public event. Tonight she was whole, successful, and genuinely loved. The transformation hadn't been about revenge, though others had certainly suffered the natural consequences of their choices. Chris would likely continue blaming others for his failures, unable to accept that his own actions had caused his downfall. Some people never learned to take responsibility for their choices. Stacy would probably move on to her next target, convinced that Barbara had somehow cheated her out of the life she deserved. She would carry the social stigma of being the other woman who destroyed a marriage, and that mark would follow her wherever she went. And Barbara? Barbara would continue building the life she had always deserved. One choice, one day, one triumph at a time. The best revenge, she had learned, wasn't destroying your enemies. It was becoming so genuinely happy that their opinion of you stopped mattering entirely. And for the first time in her adult life, Barbara Harris was exactly that. Genuinely, completely, unapologetically happy. It was a beautiful place to be. 1 year later, the autumn sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Barbara's corner office at Metropolitan Children's Hospital, casting golden light across the quarterly reports and donor correspondence that now filled her days. The morning newspapers lay neatly folded on her desk. She had long since stopped reading the society pages obsessively, though she occasionally glanced at them out of mild curiosity. Today's headline in the business section caught her attention. Vance Corporation reports record losses under new management. She didn't bother reading the article. Chris's failures were no longer her concern. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Harris? Amy appeared in the doorway with a warm smile. The foundation board meeting starts in 20 minutes. Mrs. Carnegie is already in the conference room. Barbara straightened her burgundy blazer and gathered her presentation materials. The board was reviewing her proposal for expanding the pediatric wing, and the $30 million she had raised over 18 months spoke for itself. Her success was quiet, professional, and entirely her own. The meeting went exactly as expected. The board approved her expansion plan unanimously, and Mrs. Carnegie pulled her aside afterward. Barbara, dear, the elderly philanthropist said, I've recommended you for the Regional Hospital Development Council. They need someone with your practical approach and proven results. I'm honored, Barbara replied, meaning it. This wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about meaningful work that mattered. That evening, Barbara stood in the bathroom of her Central Park apartment, applying lipstick in preparation for dinner with John. In the mirror, she saw a woman she was proud to be, successful in her chosen field, respected by her colleagues, genuinely content with her daily life. Her phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor Whitman. Heard about the board meeting today. Well done, dear. Dinner next week? Another message followed from Judge Rothschild's wife. The hospital auxiliary would like you to consider joining our executive committee. Your fundraising expertise is exactly what we need. As Barbara read the messages, she reflected on how completely her life had changed. A year and a half ago, she had been Mrs. Chris Vance, defined entirely by her relationship to a man who had ultimately discarded her. Tonight, she was Barbara Harris, A woman who had built something meaningful with her own hands and mind. Ready for dinner? John appeared in the doorway, handsome in his navy suit. Almost. Barbara capped her lipstick and turned to face him. John, can I ask you something? Always. When you first asked me to dinner back at the gala, what did you see in me? John moved closer, his hands settling gently on her waist. I saw a woman who had been told she was ordinary when she was clearly extraordinary. Someone who just needed to remember her own worth. And now? Now I see the woman you were always meant to be. Strong, independent, building something that matters. Barbara kissed him softly, feeling grateful not just for his love but for his respect for the person she had become. Over dinner at their favorite restaurant overlooking the Hudson River, John surprised her by pulling out a small velvet box. Barbara, he said, his voice unusually nervous. I know we've talked about marriage, about building something together, but before I ask you anything, I need you to know something. Barbara's heart began to race. I don't want to marry you because you're beautiful, though you are. I don't want to marry you because you complete me. I was already complete. I want to marry you because you're my equal in every way that matters. Because you've shown me what real partnership looks like. He opened the box to reveal a stunning emerald-cut diamond, elegant and timeless. Will you marry me, Barbara Harris? Not to become Mrs. John heard, but to become part of something bigger than either of us could build alone. Barbara looked at this man who had seen her value when she had forgotten it, who had supported her work without trying to control it, who offered partnership instead of ownership. Yes, she said, her voice strong and sure. Yes, I will. As John slipped the ring onto her finger, Barbara felt a moment of perfect clarity. This wasn't about replacing one marriage with another, or trading one identity for a new one. This was about two whole people choosing to build something together. Later that night, as they walked along the river with the city lights reflecting on the water, Barbara's phone buzzed with an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her look. The message was brief. Heard about your engagement. Hope you're happy. See, Barbara showed the message to John, who read it with raised eyebrows. Are you going to respond? He asked. Barbara looked at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without replying. There's nothing to say, she said simply. That chapter of my life is closed. As they continued their walk, Barbara reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the woman she had been, accommodating, insecure, willing to accept less than she deserved. She thought about the night that had changed everything, when she had chosen to stop hiding and start living her own life. Most of all, she thought about the lesson she had learned, that the best response to betrayal wasn't revenge or bitterness. It was building a life so genuinely fulfilling that the past became irrelevant. Chris was somewhere in the city tonight, probably still struggling with the consequences of his choices, still unable to understand that respect had to be earned through consistent actions, not demanded through position. Stacy had left New York months ago, carrying with her the social stigma of being the woman who destroyed a marriage. She would always be remembered for what she had taken, not for what she had built. But Barbara had learned that dignity was more powerful than drama, that building something meaningful was more satisfying than tearing someone else down, and that the best way to move on from betrayal was to create a life so solid that the past seemed like someone else's story. As John's arm tightened around her waist, and her engagement ring caught the light from the street lamps, Barbara Harris smiled. She had found her way back to herself, not the woman she had been before her marriage, but the woman she was always capable of becoming. A woman who knew her worth and refused to settle for less. A woman who built instead of destroyed. A woman who chose happiness over revenge, dignity over drama. It was exactly who she was meant to be. The end. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't destroying those who hurt you. It's building a life so beautiful that their betrayal becomes irrelevant. When someone shows you who they truly are through their actions, do you waste years trying to change them? Or do you finally believe them and walk away? I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please leave a like to help me out, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next stories. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.